One of the, I must say, many perks of being a father of a 4-month-old son is that you basically live with a human alarm, which at 5:30 a.m. sharp every single morning wakes you up. So as I probably mentioned before, I actually moved to Edinburgh only a few months ago from Italy. I'm enjoying it very much, and as soon as I came here I got to meet the lovely composers community that made me feel very welcome. And one of the guys that I met is Jack Mackenzie, which is a very young, very talented composer. Despite being so young, he has a very good experience working with orchestras, and he just started his own YouTube channel, so I'm definitely gonna link it in the description below. I'm already out of breath this morning. And he asked me if there was something that he could help me with. I thought about it and I said, yes, actually there is something. What happened is that last summer I was on holiday with my laptop, but I was trying to take a break. I wasn't really thinking about writing music, and I was listening a lot to what you would say are John Williams influences, basically romantic and late romantic composers. And I really fancied writing something in that style, what you would call a family adventure theme. The thing is that I didn't have Logic, I didn't have my samples. All I had on my laptop at the time was Dorico. So I basically wrote it as notes on paper, which is still a really great way to write music. Possibly still my favorite, which I don't really get to do anymore. And when I got back home, I did start to mug it up, but basically I never finished the job because other gigs came in and I never had a moment to finish it. And I basically asked Jack, would you care to make a little mock-up of this, starting from the score and, you know, fixing a few missing elements. The percussion part was really just sketched, didn't write much, and the ending needed a little work. You know, basically I asked him to mock it up but also finish the piece. He couldn't use any of my original mock-up because, long story short, we had no sample libraries in common, but he just bought BBC Symphonic Orchestra, which I don't own, and he decided, yes, sure, I'll make it from scratch. And I think he did a pretty good job with BBC Symphonic Orchestra, and it sounds pretty awesome. In a way, this was sort of the opposite of what you would normally do with an orchestrator or a copist. I think he did a pretty good job, and I got to mix it, which is not, you know, it's not what I normally do. I'm not a mixing engineer by any means, but obviously I do mix a lot of my own music for obvious reasons. And so I thought it would be a really cool idea to shoot a little tutorial on how to mix sample-based orchestral music. Now, you're gonna do that, but there are gonna be a couple of caveats. The first one is that I'm definitely, as I said, I'm definitely not a mixing engineer. So please comment with anything you think that I did wrong. Let me know. And also in general, a few years ago when I was scavenging YouTube for mixing tutorial on orchestral music, it was always about recorded orchestral music. There was not a lot of material on sample-based orchestral music. So if you have any resource on that, please link it below. I'm really curious to hear. I know that there is a guy, I think it's called Joël Dollier. I might butcher your name, sorry mate, if you're listening to that. And someone told me, I think actually Jack himself told me that there is a lot of information that he put out there, and he's a great mixing engineer, so I'm definitely gonna need to check his stuff out. But if you have any other resources, please do let me know. And the second caveat is that when I asked Jack to make sort of a rough mix with just the mixing position and stem those down, and also to stem a few things together, and then realized that my instructions were really terrible. It wasn't a good idea at all, because he made a unique stem for all the unpitched percussions and a unique stem for all the pitch percussions. So in the same stem you would have things like timpani, which is obviously a pitch percussion, but together with glockenspiel and xylophones, and so with all the mallets, which obviously take a completely different part of the spectral range. But I didn't want Jack to go back to the original session and stem them out again after we did so much work. Poor instructions on my side. So we do have this tiny problem in the session that I had to deal with. So I had to use quite a bit of dynamic EQ and multi-band compression, all that kind of stuff. But nonetheless, I think it's going to be useful. So please join me in the studio, and I hope you'll find it interesting.
All right, welcome back. So to start with this, I just wanted to give you a very quick overview of what I actually delivered to Jack. So this was the score, a PDF of the score, which I wrote in Dorico. And as you can see, the orchestration is pretty much all there. I mean, it was a finished piece. However, I mentioned to him that there were a few things that I wasn't really sure about. The runs were written very much in a rush. I wasn't sure that I used all the right ranges for everything. Wasn't particularly happy with the brass orchestration over here. So there were quite a few things that he fixed, and he basically worked with this file. I asked him if he wanted a MIDI export of this, and I think I gave it to him in the end, but he preferred to perform everything in, and I think that the quality of the mockup is quite good also because of that. So let's close Dorico right away, and here is my Logic session. He basically stemmed together high winds, low winds, high brass and low brass. I asked him to come up with a basic balancing in terms of make position and basic volumes within the sessions. And in fact, you'll see that I only had to do very minor adjustments in terms of the faders. We have tuned percussion and unpitched percussion, which is quite problematic because it means that you have the mallets together with things like the timpani and other tuned drums, which makes it quite complicated in terms of mix. And then violins 1, 2, violas, celli, and basses. That is the only sections that I asked them to get completely separate. Anyway, without any further ado, I just want to play this back for you. This is the mixed version, and I will go through the track, and I'll explain you what I did exactly. All right, that was fun. I really hope you enjoyed it. So, a few things about the track organization. As you said, I obviously color coded by sections, and we really have very, very little tracks here. The reason why that is that quite a bit of the mixing, of the basic balancing, was done by Jack while doing the mock-up. So I do always like to have separate reverbs for different sections. Sometimes that's very much track dependent. I even prefer to have different reverbs for different articulations. So short articulations in the strings especially obviously have different reverbs, but I didn't think that this was necessary for the nature of the track, so I limited myself to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 reverbs, which is not as much. And if I press the automation, you'll see tiny bit over here on the winds and a few more automation for the percussions, catched a couple of hits here, and accentuated a little bit of crescendos and diminuendos, that kind of stuff. I really like to keep the automations at a minimum. I do a lot of mic position automation, typically bringing up the close microphones a little bit during solos, and I asked Jack to do that, and I think he did it pretty well. And so again, a big part of the basic mixing was done. So here was a bit more about refining. The way I would do this is that I would first of all look at the reverbs, because it's such a huge part of orchestral mixing, especially with sample-based orchestral mixing. I'm always using FabFilter Pro R. I have I would say 3 main reverbs that I typically use on orchestral. One is this, the Pro R. For drier stuff, drier stuff as in with samples that come in with a less of a baked-in space. I love Altiverb because the impulse responses with real environments are absolutely fantastic. It's old, but still works great. And the third is the exponential audio stuff. I'm really interested in getting Seventh Heaven. That is on my wish list. I'll get it at some point. And then I use mostly plate for percussions, but we'll get to that. I really like this concert hall Vienna, is what I use most of the time. Here I have a 2.28 seconds, so not particularly long. The big thing to notice here is the difference in pre-delay between the woodwinds, strings, and brass. So even if it's a little bit counterintuitive, and I'm not going into a massive explanation here, you actually tend to have longer pre-delays for instruments that are actually closer to you in the concert hall. And strings are obviously pretty much in front of the audience, so is the instrument that gets the longest pre-delay. You need to be really careful with, which is why I was saying that sometimes I like to use different reverbs for different articulations, because too much of pre-delay on very short articulations can really make them sound sloppy, sort of as if there was a delay, because that's what it is really. So you want to be very careful with that. I didn't feel that it was necessary here, and I decided that this is pretty much of a typical setting for me. Anything between 25 and 30 milliseconds works on strings for me. Woodwinds and brass are a different story. The brass is typically the instruments that, in my experience, you can get away with the longest reverb tail, still not drowning them in reverb. This 2.6, the BBC Orchestral, it's not incredibly reverberant. It's not like the Spitfire stuff that has been recorded to Erlindest, but there is a little bit of space in, and I found that these settings work for me. The woodwinds are pretty much the same in terms of the tail to what I use on the strings. Typically use the shortest pre-delay on the brass, and woodwind something that is in between the strings and the brass. So I would say very generic, obviously very much situation dependent values. Strings between 25 and 30 milliseconds, woodwinds between 20 and 25 milliseconds, and brass I never go over 10, 15 milliseconds. That's what I typically use for pre-delay, and that's the basic stuff. The keys and the ARP here I actually used the default setting. I did this by ear, and I found that that worked. Again, 18 milliseconds pre-delay. I'm actually not sure why I didn't use the Vienna hole here. Might even be a mistake, but I did it by ear and it sounded fine. So it should be okay. Keep in mind that this is an algorithmic reverb, so it's not like loading an impulse response of a real space. It's a real space simulated with math, basically. For the percussion, I keep trying different things, but I always end up using plate reverbs. Love the metallic sound, and I like this hot plate preset in Valhalla Room, but there are lots of other plates that I use. One of my favorite at the moment, although I didn't own it when I was mixing this track, so that's why it's not there, is the Arturia 140 emulation. Is really great. Check out this plugin. It sounds really good, and there is this modulation option over here and 3 different model of tapes and a built-in overdrive for the plate, which is great and very useful in more than one occasion. So check it out. I think it's worth it. A thing that I love to do is to add a little bit of saturation after the plate. It gives the tail that sort of texture. And actually, why don't we listen to it for a second? And you see, I really think that it adds that warmth. Okay, another trick that I use on pretty much every reverb is to EQ the reverb. So before the reverb, if you insert an EQ, and you can roll out quite a lot of the low end and sometimes the high end as well. And this really, what it does, I feel, is that it lets you use much more reverb than you normally would get away with without getting muddy. And I use this on every single reverb. So this is for the keys, for the brass the same. It's pretty much just roll off anything between 100 and 300 hertz works really well to keep the mud under control.